Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to this live stream where we are going to talk about iOS career advice and more generally, I would say about how to grow professionally as an iOS developer. Maybe I want to start by saying that I'm pretty excited about this live stream because I've been thinking about this idea of doing a live stream on this content, on this topic for quite some time. Maybe I can start by telling you why actually I'm doing this topic, even though it's a little bit different than what I usually cover. I usually make content that are more about code, programming, and not that much about the career side of it. But the reason is that for the past year or a year and a half, I've received quite often direct messages, sometimes on Twitter, most of the time on LinkedIn, from other iOS developers that were asking for my opinion around topics related to career advice, how to grow as an iOS developer, how to grow professionally. And it's always a bit challenging to answer these questions because my opinion is not necessarily the best. And also in the context of a DM, it's hard to take the time to deliver, to take the time to provide an answer that is nuanced enough. But I thought if people keep asking, it's because people want to know my opinion, so I might as well give it, hence this live stream. So what I did is that I prepared something I listed a dozen questions, basically the questions I've received the most. But of course, if you are watching live and you have any question, comment, anything, please tell me in the chat. The goal for this live stream is to be as interactive as possible, and the questions I've listed, basically they're just there if you're not asking me anything. But if you have your own questions or anything like that, ask them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them during the live. Before we start, I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. So as I was saying just before, the topic of career advice and how to grow professionally is a topic where basically everyone has an opinion. And I don't think that my opinion is necessarily better than that of someone else. And also, my opinion, like anyone's opinion, is biased. It's influenced by choices I've made, by the country where I live, by the kind of studies I did, all of these things. And I wanted to point it out just to say that it's not because I have an opinion that you should necessarily follow it. So basically, what I would like to do before we keep on going is that if you keep watching after this point, I want you to promise me that you're not going to take a rash decision about your job just based on something that I've said. I don't want to feel responsible about giving an advice that has bad consequences for someone. So everything I'm going to say, please take it with a grain of salt. It's just my opinion. If you feel that it makes sense for your situation, for your context, then please, by all means, feel free to follow it. But if you feel that for some reason it won't work very well for you, there might be a very good reason for it. And don't just follow blindly whatever I'm going to say in the rest of this live stream. Now that I've said that, I think I can move on. So what is the first question that I've listed? It's how to keep growing your technical skills over the years. And I guess it's a question that I've been asked quite a lot in DMs, either phrased like that or phrased a bit differently, but you get the idea. How do you keep growing when you're a junior, but also when you're more of an intermediate developer, when you've become a senior developer, etc., etc. So let's see how I can try and answer this question. So if it's about really like growing your technical skills, I would say a first part of the answer could be to identify the best places to learn new technical things. So I can tell you about a few that exist. So typically Apple's WWDC videos, as it happens when we do the live stream, we are just a few days before the new WWDC. But if you are getting started into iOS, then just watching the WWDC videos can be a great way to learn more about the language, the ecosystem, the APIs that are the most useful. Then you've got, of course, all of the great content creators and bloggers and podcasters, etc., in the iOS community. So I could only recommend to check out websites like the website of Antoine Vanderlee, of Donny Valls, the newsletter iOS code review, for instance. There is a lot of great community content. There is a website that actually lists them all. I have forgotten its name, but it's made by the person who runs the newsletter iOS Dev Weekly. So I guess if you just like search for iOS Dev Weekly, you will find it pretty easily. But yeah, finding like all of these content creators and following them in one way or another. So it could be through social media. It could be just by subscribing to an RSS feed on their website. Is also a way to keep like great content delivered to you over the weeks. As we talk of great content, also newsletters. You've got a few very popular newsletters, like I guess the biggest two that comes to my mind are iOS Dev Weekly and the newsletter of Antoine Vanderlee, who are like the biggest in terms of number of subscribers. And subscribing to these two newsletters, it's basically you're guaranteed to get into your mailbox new articles every week. And if you just like read one article from each of these two emails every week, well, then over the course of 1 year, you will have read 104 articles, which honestly is, I would say, more than the majority of iOS developers, and it's already like it's already a great way to grow your technical skills. Then what I would also suggest is that you want to not only have a broad knowledge of iOS, but you also want to have a deep knowledge of a few topics. So here it really depends on what you enjoy and the kind of apps that you're working on. But for instance, if you're working on an app that deals with data persistence, so that uses things like core data, for instance, or that uses Realm or any other way to save data on disk, then you might want to really take the time to understand how these frameworks work, take a look at their documentation, take a look at advanced articles on the topic. It can be a great way to understand deeply how something works. And I would say you don't need to understand deeply how everything works, but knowing how one or two things work deeply is already a great step forward, because when you learn for the first couple of time how a piece of software works, like from top to bottom, not only do you acquire knowledge in how that particular piece of software works, but you also acquire knowledge on how complex pieces of software work. And that's a great way to be able to gain some confidence into how to design some more complex systems. And then finally, I would say also, I guess you need to keep yourself motivated throughout like the month and the years. And so setting like some goals for yourself can be a nice thing. I know that in some companies you have a yearly or quarterly goals, but there is nothing that prevents you from also setting that kind of goals for yourself. So for instance, if you're just getting started, you could say, okay, I want this quarter to have read like that many articles or watched that many WWDC videos, and then maybe in the context of your work, you could tell to yourself, okay, well, if there is like new features that needs to be developed from scratch, maybe like over the course of maybe one quarter could be a bit too small, but over the course of maybe one semester, you want to have participated in laying out like all of the foundation to implement a feature from scratch. I would say it's a good way to kind of like gamify things, but also keep you motivated and having a clear goal. A clear attainable goal that you are working towards. I would say it's a great way to keep pushing yourself. And I can tell you, like even for me, for instance, not earlier this month because we are in June. So last month I released like my first paid content, and that was my goal. Like for the month, I was like, okay, this month I want to release my first paid content. What kind of topic could it be? How can I make it that I have like recorded and edited all of the videos in 1 month? And that was a great way for me to keep myself motivated by having this very clear objective that I was following. And finally, I see a question in the chat, so I'm excited to answer it. But before I move on to that question, I want to try and see if I have anything more to say on that topic of how to grow your technical skills over the years. I would say yes. Also, maybe if you're lucky enough that you are in a company where there are developers, engineers that are more experienced than yourself, and that are kind of like okay to give you advice, that they are like basically that they are not like toxic people, they are people that are willing to help you, then I would say it can be a great way to try and leverage this possibility, and so ask them for advice if they have some knowledge on some specific topic. Whenever you have the opportunity of asking, hey, oh, by the way, how does this thing work in the app? It can be a great thing. Like I know that at work, for example, I have a colleague that is very knowledgeable on image rendering and doing all of the low-level stuff. And if at some point I'm wondering on how something works in the app, and I have the opportunity to ask him, I always do it because I know that he will take the time to give me an explanation, to help me like figure out the big picture thing. And it's always a big advantage when you have that kind of people with you at work. Okay, I think I've said everything for that question. Let me see the questions in the chat. There are a few questions, that's great. So Michael, you're asking, how do you go about learning a new framework where no one has any examples and Apple's documentation isn't clear at all? That's a very good question. And it kind of ties in with what I've just said, because I guess I would suggest to have a clear goal for yourself. So usually when you want to learn a new framework, it's because you want to achieve something in the app that you work on. So I would say try to create, I don't know, like follow an MVP approach. Be like, okay, what is the simplest thing I could use this framework to achieve? Try to make it work this way. Even though you will still need to make some educated guesses, if the scope of what you're trying to achieve is small enough, it should still feel manageable. But it's true that when there is really like zero documentation, it can be tough. To be honest, I feel like Apple, they have gotten a bit better over the years, but sometimes you also need to know where to look for. For instance, if I think typically of SwiftUI, Apple has made some great tutorials on how to build apps using SwiftUI, but they're not really part of the documentation, and sorry, it's really easy to miss them. So you want to make sure that you look like in every corner to find if there isn't anything that you could use. But yeah, I guess that would be my best guess. Like try to take it like step by step, and setting like achievable goals that are increasingly complex. This way, it feels like okay, you're into the unknown, but at least you get like you give yourself goals that you're trying to converge towards, and so you can get a sense of progression. And also, once you've achieved the goal, you can start thinking, okay, let's look back at what I've done. Do I feel like there are things I could improve, and basically have this very iterative approach. That's the word I should have used earlier on, to try and have a very iterative approach. Then I see another question. So Neil, I hope I pronounced it okay. You're saying, I've I've got 4 years of experience, haven't worked on Thread and GCD much. Right now, facing when they ask to show code or any task at the moment. So how should I go further? Also seeking SwiftUI, also seeking to learn SwiftUI. So I would say if you feel that there are topics that you are not knowledgeable enough, first thing, already being aware of it, being mindful enough that you are aware of it is already a very good thing. I would say try to narrow your focus on maybe one thing to learn. For instance, when you talk about threading, you talk about GCD. There is also Swift concurrency. Now there is Combine. So I would say maybe try to focus on the one of these that you feel it really makes sense for you to learn. It could be the one that you're the most interested in. It could be the one that employers where you're living are the most interested in hiring for in terms of skills. But try to pick one and then try maybe to just just learn about it. Maybe a great way to demonstrate if your goal is to show to an employer that you have some experience is to you create a repo on GitHub and you try to just document your learning process. So for instance, you're like, okay, my goal was to learn this framework. So first I wanted to achieve that goal and I did it in that project, which is in this directory. Then I wanted to do that, etc., etc. And even though it might not be production ready code or it might not be super polished, at least it shows that that you've made the effort. And if also it shows that you've kept working on this learning process over the course of a few weeks or even a few months, it also shows that you had some good dedication, and that can be also very important when you are seeing the resume of a candidate and you see that they've made a lot of effort to learn and it's visible to you because either they share that on social media or on GitHub or on whatever on their own blogs. Well, just that gives a positive feeling because you're if that person has made the effort of learning things and also communicating about it, it gives you the feeling that okay, well, when that same situation is going to happen at work, that person will need to learn things autonomously. There shouldn't be any problem for that person to do so. I hope I've answered at least partially your question, but if you want me to elaborate on anything, please feel free to ask again in the chat. Okay, and then you were mentioning things okay, so Michael, you were mentioning feels like screen time API, family control, device management. Device management feels much harder indeed to understand. I think one of the reasons is that because the people who go really deep into device management are the people who work on software to manage devices at scale, and so these companies, they basically don't have a lot of interest, of economical interest in sharing what they've learned because they would basically be giving information away to their competitors. So yes, I agree that device management is something that is hard to learn as an individual when you're not in the context of having the resources of a company. I see. Very interesting question. So, John, you're asking, will the hybrid language like Flutter React Native overcome native app languages? I feel like it's a question that's been around ever since I started doing iOS, or ever since the first hybrid frameworks came out, which was something a bit more than 10 years ago now, with the first versions of PhoneGap. Honestly, I would say no because I still haven't seen a strong decrease in native apps. It might be possible that in some geographies, maybe it makes more sense to do an hybrid approach if you're making an app that is specifically targeted for a country, because it's basic economics at that point. If your country has a smaller population than a big country like the US, for instance, maybe it doesn't make sense to develop two code bases. I can give you an example. Me, I live in France, and in France, even French apps. For instance, I worked a lot on the apps of the big national French bank, and most of the time they could still afford to do both Android and iOS native apps. The cases where I've seen people go into like companies go with hybrid approaches, it was either because they didn't want to have to deal with engineers with a specific skill set. And for instance, because React Native was quite close to React on the web, it could allow them to feel like they had more like homogeneous engineering teams, which I guess could make sense from their point of view. And also companies for whom there is really like not a lot of value in having a native app. Like for instance, in France, I've seen like some startups that basically they do something that is innovative in their field, but their app is just basically an app that just calls some web services and is basically a front end for a collection of API endpoints. In that case, they don't always feel like it's worth investing into a native app, but today I don't feel like we are lacking opportunities in native apps, at least in France, but it might be very different depending on where you live. So please don't take like my advice on that without checking how is the job market where you live. But at least I can tell you like I've never felt the need to go deep into learning hybrid frameworks. I did a bit of PhoneGap / Cordoba like 10 years ago. Also a bit of Ionic in the very first version. I followed a training session on Flutter like 4 years ago, but never applied it. It was just like for like technical curiosity that I attended it. So I would still say that it's worth learning native languages. That's my opinion. But if you find that it's either you enjoy more the hybrid approaches or that it's what makes more sense to get a job in the place you live in, honestly, I think it can also be like a choice that kind of like I mean, it's not a bad choice. You know, I don't know React Native a lot, but what I saw from Flutter is that Flutter in its approach is not that different from frameworks like SwiftUI or Jetpack Compose on Android, at least on the big picture thing. So I would say like even if you learn it and you find out after a few years that you don't enjoy it that much, you should still be able to switch back to native, and not everything that you will have learned will go to the waste bin. You know, like there are some transferable skills. All right, I think I've answered all the questions we had in the chat for now, but please, if you have more questions, please keep them coming. And me, I'm going to move on to the next question I had listed, which was which kind of companies provide the best career opportunities? I think I made a typo in writing this one. So once again, an interesting question, and one where I would say almost no one can provide like an exhaustive answer, because almost no one has experienced all of the different setups, settings, and kind of companies. So I can tell you about what I have gone through for my experiences. So I started iOS in a startup as an intern in 2011. But it was for a short internship, and back then also things were still like everything was pretty new, so I felt a bit lost at the time. But I guess it was like inevitable when you are an intern only on the second year of college classes. So that's where I started. Then I moved on to a service company for my first job. So in France, service company, it's very specific things. There might not be an equivalent in all of the countries, but basically, when you work for a service company, the service company pays you, but they basically like sell your skills to end customers. So it's like you're paid by company A, but then you go to work on the premises of company B. So it's a bit of a weird system that might not have an equivalent on every country. So I did that for like 1 year, I think, after I graduated, and so I went to work for a company that is a home appliance manufacturer in France, because they were starting to release Bluetooth-enabled home appliances, and more specifically cooking appliances. And so they needed people to build the apps that would connect with the appliances. So it was a good opportunity to learn how to do iOS at scale. But what kind of sucks with this kind of companies is that you are not really in control of where you work. It's the salespeople that will sell your skill to one client over the other, and you don't always have a say into who you're going to work for. So I would say it can be kind of nice when you're getting started, but it can also like get you to work in places which are like not that great, and you don't have a lot of agency into where you're going to work. So that's why I only stayed 1 year into that kind of company. Then I went to work for a more like classical like contracting slash agency company, where basically we would make apps for end customers, but we would be like making apps in the premises of the company I was working for. So there was not like this dynamic of the company is selling your skills, and it's basically like renting you as an engineer to another company. And that was kind of a good experience, because we were working like we had like the critical mass of engineers, and good engineers with good level that you could like learn from other people, and try to have a team that wants to like improve the quality of the app that they are delivering. So this kind of agency slash contracting company, I found it to be quite a good experience. Also because often you can have like opportunities to grow professionally. For instance, going from developer to lead developer, that kind of things. It was also when I was getting started at speaking at conferences, because it was a big company. It was good for them to have engineers speaking at conferences, and so they would be able to sponsor my speaking activities by letting me do that on company time, and also sometimes like paying for the planes or the hotel or that kind of thing. So that was pretty good, and I stayed there like for 6 years. So I wouldn't have stayed there for 6 years if it wasn't an interesting experience. And then more recently, I went back to working at a startup, but as a more senior developer. And it's an experience that I'm pretty happy with also. Like when you are senior, in the sense that you have a good knowledge of your job, you can find some startups that are ready to give you a good level of autonomy and ownership. And I feel like it's a great way to basically like how should I put it, like to keep a high level of interest in what you are doing, because you're no longer contracting and working for whatever a customer is asking you to do. You're trying to make like the best possible app, and so if you have an idea on something that could improve the app, you can like share it with your team and then start working on it. It's a very different like state of mind. When I was working for a contracting company, in the end, the goal of the company is to deliver an app that is good enough, but also in an amount of time that isn't too long, so that the company still makes money. Whereas when you're working for a startup that is developing its own product, your goal is really to make like the best app possible. And if there is something that could like improve the experience a lot, but that takes a bit of time to implement, it can still make sense for the company to to dedicate that time to do it, and that's something that I found is quite great. So I'm pretty pleased with where I am. So if I were to just sum it up, I would say I guess the easiest way to find a job when you're getting started is contracting companies or mobile agencies or service companies, because usually they have a need to hire people to either do the project that they've won with customers, or to rent your skills to other companies. So it can be good to get started, but I would say the places where you are the best places to grow are the places where like the team is of good quality. I guess I would try to optimize for the quality of the team, because in the end, if like the people that you work with they are insufferable, or it's a really toxic atmosphere or whatever, it's going to be a bad experience. So I would say like if you can find a place where you have great teammates and opportunities to grow, it can be very good. And when you feel that you are like reaching the point where you have a good level of autonomy, then looking at startups that have like a good product, a good traction with their market, that basically have some kind of product market fit, then it can be very interesting to go to the next step. And it won't be the same thing that if you were an indie dev developer, of course, but still you can gain a lot more ownership and a lot more agency on the project that you're working on than when you're working for a company that is contracting. And finally, I have less experience in big tech companies, so companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, or that kind of companies, because I have never worked for them, so I only have like second-hand knowledge. From what I've heard is that often in these companies, you will work on very specific topics and sometimes in very specific architectures. So it's possible that like you will in your work you will rely on processes or architecture that have been set up by others before you, and so it's a different trade-off. Like you will know some things with very deep knowledge, but then maybe you won't be aware of other parts of the app that you're working on. So you will maybe get more of a specialist approach than someone who is more like of a generalist. I mean, that being said, when you get offered a job, especially as a junior in that kind of companies, I would say it's still more than worth it, just because of like of the compensation that they offer and the line that you can also put on your resume. Yeah, so I think it's one of the questions where it's very hard to give a definitive answer, but also because there is no like definitive answer. I guess it depends on what you want to do, where you want to work. Maybe one last thing that I should say is that with remote becoming like I wouldn't. Should I say popular? Because there is a big debate on whether remote is here to stay or not. But at least remote is much more common these days than when I started working 10 years ago. I would say it opens up the way to more opportunities. And the better you get at your job, and the better you get with your technical skills, with your skills of working efficiently within a team, with your professional skills basically, the more you can access very interesting remote jobs. And that's something that you definitely want to consider, because for instance, right now I have a remote job because my company is based in Paris, but I don't live in Paris, and I don't think I would have gotten a similar opportunity in Lyon, where I live. Actually, I'm trying to think about it, but I don't have any company in mind that is in Lyon that offers like a similar like similar opportunities and job setting than what Photoroom offers. So I would say definitely look towards a remote position, because it's already like a great way to access great opportunities, and opportunities that might not have been available to everyone just a few years back. Then let me have a look at the chat. So Satisine, you're saying, hey Vincent, I'm in Lyon also. That's amazing. And think about getting into iOS development, but it seems there are not so many jobs out there for iOS in France. What are your thoughts? Good question. It's true that there is probably less job postings for iOS in France than there are for web development. For instance, that's definitely the case. I would say there are also much less people doing iOS in France than people doing web development. To keep the analogy, so I don't have the feeling that there is a shortage of iOS jobs in France right now. It might be less of a hiring frenzy than what there might have been just like 1 year ago or 2 years ago. But I also don't have the feeling that there has been a big stop in hiring. That being said, I don't. I also don't monitor the hiring like market regularly because I'm just not looking for a job right now. So yeah, I would say if you learn iOS and you're pretty good at it, I would say that there are still opportunities, but also I would say definitely you want to make sure of it. So yeah. What kind of advice could I give you? Um, I would say, of course, like I mean, you've probably already looked for the kind of job that are like the job posting that you can have in Lyon, but I would say like in Lyon, like in many big French cities, there is an iOS meetup that happens like every 2 or every 3 months. So it's called Coco Heads Lyon, and you can find it on Meetup. I would say maybe it can be a good idea like to come and attend it. Once, just to try and connect with a few people and like get a sense of how is the market in Lyon, because it's a great way to get like some first hand knowledge of how the market is, because then you interact with people who are actually working in the city. Maybe some of them are also hiring, so that's what I would recommend, and I guess I would recommend that to anyone that is wondering like what are the hiring opportunities if you are fortunate to live in a city where there is an iOS meetup that happens there regularly. Definitely like attending and talking with people can be a great way to connect with other iOS developers. And even if you're just getting started on your learning journey, don't forget that just by showing up at an iOS meetup, you are already showing that you are making an effort and that you are engaged into like learning and developing your skills, because there are a lot of people that will be like starting maybe a training course or enrolling into a bootcamp about iOS, but that will not make that effort of actually going to speak with the actual people. So I would say, don't go into thinking, oh, but I'm not knowledgeable enough. If you want to start learning iOS and you feel that you want to take the time to attend these events, which are free to attend, by the way, definitely do it, and it can only have a positive outcome. I see your questions. Have you completed your move to SwiftUI or still using UIKit? So at work, we still use UIKit a lot. We use SwiftUI when it makes sense for views that are simple enough that you can make them in SwiftUI, but we still use the two of them a lot. You're saying so you would be interested in a meetup in Lyon, but you're looking for English position, though, as you are English and your French is still terrible. So, the meetup, so the presentation will be in French. Then, if you start talking with people, I'm sure most of the people will be able to talk with you in English. But it's true that you need to be ready to be able to like bear through the presentations being in French. But there are some There are some English teams. I'm sure there are companies like the company that I work for instance. We do everything in English because we have non-French speakers in the team. But I do recognize that it puts an additional level of difficulty. That being said, there are also remote positions available. So even if you are based in a city in France, maybe like you can also look towards like remote positions in other European countries that you could be able to apply to, if that's possible, because I know that there is then like questions of like working visa that can come into the topic, but it can also be like a great way to get an English friendly job. And yeah, like there are many companies where like people operate in English at some level, but not all of the development teams operate in English in a day-to-day in their day-to-day. So that's where you can kind of see sometimes a bit of a difference. I think I've answered all the questions in the chat for now, but there are questions, and there are great questions, which is amazing. I'm going to move on to the next question I had listed, so which is how to progress towards more senior positions. Once again, a very like open question with no definitive answer, but I guess as for all of the questions, like I can share like how it went for me. I guess I would say whenever there are like challenging topics, try to work on these topics, or manifest to your manager or lead developer or architect or whoever makes these decisions that you are interested in working on challenging topics. I would say. Then I would say also like trying to have like focus your attentions on the topic that you work on, but the topics that you do work on, try to have like a strong sense of ownership over these topics. And by ownership, I mean like try to think in terms like, are you proud of how the feature is made? How could you improve it? How could you polish it in a way where you're still like not spending a crazy amount of time, but you're delivering something that you are proud of. I would say that's a great way to demonstrate that like you are a reliable person. I guess if we break it down to move towards more senior positions, you need two things. You need to have the skills to handle more complex challenges, and also you need like either your manager or your lead developer or your architect or whoever makes these decisions to feel that you are reliable enough. And so I would say trying to take a strong ownership of some topics is a good way to work like in both of these directions, because it will force you, if you want to improve things, to learn how to improve them. And also, if people see that you're making some extra effort to improve like how things are in your code base, it will also help give the feeling that you are someone that is reliable. So that's I guess that's the more like generic slash general blueprint towards moving to more senior positions. Also, a very important skill to develop is how to communicate effectively, because the more you evolve towards senior position, and the less coding will be like your entire focus. You also need to interact with stakeholders, maybe with more junior developers also. So trying to have a good communication with stakeholders, like a product manager, a project manager, this kind of people can also be a great skill to develop. And basically, yeah, not being afraid to challenge yourself. um, Setting what I've said a bit earlier, but setting like ambitious but realistic goals can be a great way to do it. What you often hear is that people who are promoted into senior positions, often they were actually doing the job before they were promoted, in the sense that the person who will, like, for instance, be promoted to a lead developer, it's very likely that it won't be that one day like the manager comes and says, hey, now you are lead developer. It will probably be that that person like took more responsibility, demonstrated that they were eager to progress, they were reliable. It reached a point where they were basically doing the job of a lead developer in an unofficial way. And so the day that they are officially promoted, what happens is that the management actually like acknowledges a situation that was already ongoing, rather than creates a new situation. So that's also something like to keep in mind, because sometimes like there are people who don't realize it and then don't understand, oh, why was this person like promoted, even though like I was also like interesting to get that promotion. Why didn't they think of me? And often that's the reason. It's because like the person that is promoted actually already set event in motion, and the promotion was just like the official acknowledgement that these events were correctly set in motion. So yeah, I would say that would be like my more general advice is like to have like agency, basically. So don't expect things to happen. Just like take matters into your own hands. Like if you want to be a senior developer, then look at the senior developers like where you're working at. For instance, what are the skills that they possess? What are the qualities that they possess that you think led them to these positions? And then try to see how you can work your way through acquiring these skills. And also, if the people in the senior positions are people that you feel that are ready to help you, also like trying to just let them know, like asking them like how did you get there, what are the things I should do like in the following year in order to reach a more senior position. That can also be a great approach, like asking your manager, for instance, if you have yearly performance review, saying, okay, I would like to be in a more senior position by next year. What should I be doing during the current year to reach that goal? It can be a great way to get things started. With everything, it's not guaranteed that it will work, but at least like like you miss 100% of the shots that you never take. So just by trying to make things happen, there is a higher level of chance that they will actually happen. And also it can happen that for whatever reasons, like in your company, either there isn't enough room for more senior people, or you feel that people won't consider you for a promotion. Then in this kind of situation, applying for a senior job in another company can sometimes be a great way to grow into the position. And I've seen more than one people doing this, and it's also a very common pattern to progress, like to job hop onto a new position in order to get something that for some reason wasn't attainable at your current job. But I would say, especially if you like your current job or your current company, make sure that what you want to get isn't achievable like just from within the company, because I've also seen people that just thought, okay, yes, I want to progress, then I need to switch job and go to work for another company, whereas they could have actually achieved the same thing with taking like less risks, and maybe also like less effort. So you want to make sure that basically you want to be aware of your surroundings and know what is possible or not, but don't assume that things are not possible where you are working at, because it can be very easy actually. And I would say it's very like it's a normal bias that we always see that the pasture is always greener outside, basically, and we tend to over evaluate the unknown quantity, and so we tend to think that other places will give us better opportunities than when we are at, but it's not always true. Sometimes it's true, but it's not always true, and so it's important to fight this bias and try to make sure that we have a good understanding of the situation. Let me see in the chat. So Abhishek, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Where do you see iOS down the line 7-8 years after coming to AI tools like ChatGPT? So do I mean, where do I see iOS in 8 years from now? My answer will be I have no clue, because 8 years is a long time. So we are in 2023. If you do minus 8 years, it was 2015. So in 2015, Swift had just been released for 1 year. Would you have been able to predict that there would be tools like Copilot and ChatGPT coming? So I would say it's hard to imagine where it's going to go. We can imagine that the most common coding tasks might be automated by tools like ChatGPT or Copilot. But what's also very possible is that maybe this gain in productivity will be compensated by an increasing level of complexity in the apps that we develop, and so we will still need to spend as much time coding, but it will be a different kind of coding. Maybe it will be like prompt engineering. I don't know, but I think there is a good chance that whatever gain in productivity you get from a tool, you lose it, because it also allows the apps that you work on to gain in complexity. Typical example I could share to explain how it can happen. When Swift was released, it allowed us, I would say, to gain in productivity when compared with Objective-C, because you could write the same code faster in Swift than in Objective-C. Not in all contexts. I'm sure there are contexts where Objective-C is still faster to write than Swift, but in general, at least the feeling I had was that you were able to write code faster in Swift than in Objective-C. But also, at the same time, is, for instance, when bigger iPhones were released, and so we had to deal with bigger size screens. Then we had to deal with also multitasking on iPadOS, so being able to have more than one app open at the same time. All these things that made our apps more complex, and so what we gained in productivity by the introduction of Swift and of better framework, we kind of lost it by the complexity that apps had to gain to fit the more recent devices. So I could very well imagine tools like Copilot version, Xcode's own Copilot version, making us gain time in writing code. But maybe there is a new, I don't know, AR headset or mixed reality headset that is released, and making apps for this kind of devices requires much more complexity. And so what we want on the one hand, we kind of lost it on the other hand. It's possible that the job will change a bit, but it might be, if you were a developer writing COBOL or writing Fortran in the 80s or the 90s, and you see Swift UI, maybe it feels the same way than prompt engineering will feel to us in 10 years. So I would say coding might evolve, but I don't think that coding will disappear altogether. Even though no one knows what will happen in the future. I mean, it's anyone's guess. And my opinion isn't necessarily better than that of someone else on that topic. Okay, so I see, Steph, you're saying fully agree with you. It's a mindset that you have to have if you want to progress, whatever job you could do. Yeah, exactly. Like I would say, it's you need to set goals like for yourself and works toward like improving your skills. And if you're fortunate enough that you work in a job where the job can help you on that path, that's great. But if that's not the case, like with all the resources available online for free these days, you're more than able to also improve your skills by yourself, which is great because, for instance, like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, people didn't have like this advantage, and maybe your success professionally was more conditioned to the kind of company that you were working. Yatin, you're asking how to start learning iOS development. I guess I will give like the typical answer. The Stanford course, which I think is still being updated every year. So CS 193P, if I remember it correctly, which is available for free, I think on Stanford's website or on YouTube. And then I would say hacking with Swift. So Paul Hudson's website has some great content in the forms of 100 days of Swift and 100 days of Swift UI, which is like a series of daily challenges to learn Swift and Swift UI. So it's a great way to keep yourself like engaged because you have something to do like every day. And even though I didn't like follow it like myself, I think it's a great way to learn, to keep yourself motivated to learn, and also it encourages you, I think, to share what you're learning in public. And it's yeah, basically a great way to have a dynamic start and then maintained over the course of a few months. So you're saying, yeah, ChatGPT is a good debugging tool, but it's still like it's still a tool, and it's however you were going to use it that will like that will shape like what your future job will look like. I can tell you, like at work, like maybe a couple of weeks ago, I needed to do like some web development just because we have an API, and I wanted to make a demo project of this API for the web. I haven't done web in a very long time, so I asked ChatGPT and GPT-4 to help me like develop this simple web app, and I was impressed with ChatGPT because I was able to get like a simple web app working in over the course of one afternoon. So I'm very excited to see like where it's going to go. I can tell you that if on Monday they announce, if Apple announces like some kind of ChatGPT or Copilot integrated into Xcode, I'm doing a live stream the following day just to try it. Like you can hold me on that, definitely. And I'm very curious to see like how coding will look like. Actually, if you want to ask yourself what if you want to ask yourself like what iOS engineering will look like in 7 or 10 years, you might try to rephrase it in asking yourself like what could Xcode look like in 7 or 10 years. And I think it can be a good like thought exercise. Let's see. Yash, you're saying in 8 years we've gone from Objective-C plus UIKit to Swift plus Swift UI. So indeed, we've already seen like some big shifts on iOS. Interestingly, Android had pretty much the same shift with first Kotlin and then Jetpack Compose. And so you were always saying legacy projects still exist, so we'll definitely need coding engineers compared to prompt engineers. Yeah, and I see it more like coding engineers will just evolve their skills basically. And just like coding in Swift UI feels like very like declarative compared to people who are doing assembly like a couple decades ago. Maybe like the coding tools we will have in the future will feel super powerful compared to whatever we are using right now. Maybe like Swift UI today will feel like assembly in the future. All right, let me see a few things. Eduardo, you're saying, I live in Mexico. I want to get a job in a foreign company. What advice would you give me apart from improving my English? I'm currently watching lots of videos from Kodak and Coursera. So because in a way like your situation well, your situation is specific to your situation, but is a bit foreign compared to like what I've experienced. I would say if you can find other people that achieved what you're trying to achieve, and find them like on social media, for instance, and asking them for their advice can be a great thing, because it's likely that whatever works for them will also work for you. So I would say that can be a first strategy, and then maybe try and look at the kind of position that you want to apply for, and see what they are expecting. Maybe like if you can find like the contact of some recruiters in these companies, or hiring managers on social media, and just reaching out to them and saying, hey, like in the future, I would like to work for your company. I'm still on a learning journey, but would you recommend that I focus on? Or like here is my like resume and portfolio right now. What is still missing for you to consider me? I guess it can be a good strategy, kind of similar to what I was saying about like showing up to a meetup when you're still learning. If you make the effort of reaching out to recruiters or hiring managers, to ask them like what you're still missing to get them to consider you for a job, you're already doing something that maybe like the majority of candidates in your positions are not doing, and so you're already not only like setting yourself apart in a good way, but you're already starting to make progress. So I guess yeah, this is what I would recommend, and then trying to learn like from online courses can also help. But I would say yeah, make sure that you have some discussions with people that could hire you. This way you can try and make sure that you're making efforts in the right direction. I guess what I want to say is that what you don't want is, for instance, to follow like 5 courses on Coursera that kind of like overlap each other. Maybe it's not the best way to invest your time and your energy, and maybe 3 courses were already enough. That's the trap that I think is important to avoid, because it's very easy to get into this trap. I hope this advice was able to help you, and made sense to you. Um, Steph, you're saying main issue with the free content is that in most cases tests are not in the learning path. That's true that test is always a complicated topic. One reason why there might not be that much content about testing is because testing is kind of similar to, it's kind of not similar, it's kind of specific to a bit each project. So it's harder to give like if I were to myself create some content around testing, I'm not sure I would know like which direction to go, so that the content can be useful for the most the content is useful in most situations, because testing can still depend on the kind of architecture that you are following. Um, but maybe what I would recommend for testing is to look at the technical blogs of some companies, because it's very possible that some big companies, they publish some content about how they test either their apps or their SDKs. Like for instance, I know that Revenue Cat, they have a blog article about how they test their SDK. So that might be a good direction to look into in order to gain more knowledge on how people implement tests in the industry. Yatin, you're saying, is there any good tutorial you would like to suggest when someone wants to switch from declarative to reactive programming with SwiftUI and Combine? Some good tutorial. If you want to switch, or if you want to like switch from UIKit to SwiftUI and Combine, honestly, I would say like all the SwiftUI tutorials, if you have some experience with UIKit, of course you will be able to follow them, and you will be able to follow them like much faster than someone with not a lot of experience. For Combine, I know that Donny Valls wrote a book. I think it's called I've forgotten the name. Is it? I don't think it's Pragmatic Combine, because he has written a book about core data, one on Combine and one on Swift concurrency, and I've completely forgotten practical. That's it. It's not pragmatic, it's practical. So he wrote a book called Practical Combine, which I think could be useful, could be very useful to learn Combine. And there is also obj.io, which is a website that makes a lot of content around iOS, and they have a lot of content and books about SwiftUI. And so that's something that I could also recommend that you check out. Xcode will still be buggy and crash every 5 minutes for the next 8 years. Yeah, that's basically like the big invariant of iOS development. You're saying, I don't think AIs will be a viable replacement for real devs since it can't yet architect large-scale maintainable apps projects. It's mostly just good for small code snippets. That you're making an excellent point is that how will AI be able to scale besides like giving some very specific advice on small topics or starting things from scratch. I guess it's kind of like very linked to the amount of token that a ChatGPT-like model can have in their memory. But the day where like you can just drop a copy of your Xcode project to an AI and ask it to make like either develop new features or find a bug, I would be very curious to see what would happen. You know, the day where you can just like drop in like your entire source code to ChatGPT and be like, hey, we have this problem reported by users. What do you think could be causing it? I would be very curious to see what such a model would be able to say, but maybe this is like the next frontier for this kind of AI copilot tools, like their ability to understand an entire large code base in its totality and not just like small pieces that you give it whenever you need help on these small pieces. Another question, in general, how much does an applicant have to know to be able to add value as a junior engineer first iOS job? I would say it really depends on the kind of company, but my previous company, we were hiring junior people that were just straight out of school. So people that would have had maybe like one internship in iOS, either one internship in iOS or a very strong interest in iOS. Often, like we would like hire them for a 6-month internship at the end of their degree and then hire them for a real job once the internship was over. So I guess my point, I would say, like for a junior position, if you have graduated and you've already done an internship on iOS, I would say you are assuming that you have a good level of skills, you're able like to you're able to contribute and to bring value to a team. I don't think you need like years of experience for that. And anyway, like everyone has got to get started at some point. So if you are still in a if you haven't yet graduated and you still need to do internships and you're interested in iOS, then doing an iOS internship is of course a big advantage. But as a junior, if you are playing for a junior position and you can demonstrate like a strong interest towards iOS and show that maybe you've already tried to follow like some learning materials online, it can be like for some positions it can be enough. Of course, it depends like on the kind of company. There are companies that hire junior as an HR strategy, we could say, and then they invest a bit of time into training them. There are other companies that focus more on senior people because they focus on autonomy, for instance. And so these companies, of course, they will have less opportunities for people who have just graduated. But I would say for a junior job, like if you've done like a 4-month internship, it's already great. And even if you haven't got your first experience, if you can demonstrate a strong interest and even better some learning efforts you made on your end, I guess it can be enough to get the first job. Of course, there is no like absolute rule, and it will depend on a lot of factors, like the kind of company you're working on, what they are looking for in their new hire. But my previous company, we have hired a lot of junior people that were getting started, and because the company was totally like okay with it. It was never like any issue basically. Yeah, you think that the hardest thing is getting out of tutorials slash courses hell. I agree that there is one point where like you've done enough, and it's important to be able to identify that point and not just like, especially when you are self-taught. It's very easy to fall into this bad pattern, and basically like the day that you feel like okay, you're not learning anything, or you're almost not learning anything new, then you can just like try and move on to other things. And yeah, ToonsDev has some great content. I definitely agree. So it's another YouTube channel. And Karin Prater, I don't know her content, but if you recommend it, I completely like trust you on it that it must be some good content. All right, and then I see there was some discussions about testing content, and I think I will resume in the questions I had prepared also, so that I can keep on like moving towards them, because I see like it's already a bit more than 1 hour. I was thinking it could be between 2 hour and 30 minutes. We'll see, but there is so much things to say about these questions. What skills are needed to be considered an expert? This question, I think I have received it like verbatim, written that way, and I wanted to put it because I think the word expert can be very intimidating, and it's not a word that I would use like to describe myself. For instance, I know that on my LinkedIn profile, one of my past experiences still says like senior iOS expert, because it was a title I had in the company, and they were happy if I put it on LinkedIn. But maybe I should actually like change it. Not as I think about it, but I would say like the word expert is very daunting, and it can feel very unattainable. But personally, like myself, I don't have the goal of trying to be an expert on anything. What I try to do is to be in a situation where when I'm faced with a problem, I am able to provide a solution that solves the problem in a reasonable amount of time. Like the goal is not to be like, okay, there is this problem. Of course, this is the perfect solution that is recommended by the book, and we just implement it, and I'm the expert because I know all of the solutions in the book. It's more about, okay, there is this challenge we need to tackle. Because of my experiences, here is how I think we should try and solve it. We try and apply this, we see how it goes, and then we correct course. Basically, I would say that if you want to be like a very good iOS developer, maybe a very important skill is to be able to quickly provide an initial solution for a problem and then iterate over that first result, rather than trying to have some clear-cut solution that will work perfectly for the problem that you're working on. And also, we need to also be very aware that iOS and mobile apps in general is a field that is constantly evolving, and so like having like expertise in such a fast-moving field is also like I don't know, like, can you really have expertise in a fast-moving field? So yeah, that's why I wanted to include this question, because I wanted to address the fact that trying to set for yourself the goal to be considered as an expert might not be the best goal, the best possible goal, or it can be also like some kind of loophole or whatever. And I can tell you, as someone who has spoken at a lot of conferences, like all of the other speakers I've been able to talk to, there are of course people who are very good and very knowledgeable, but they are not people who will be able to answer any question that you could have with 100% certainty and in a very short amount of time. It's more about like building up the skills where you feel confident to tackle increasingly difficult challenges, and basically like you have in your toolbox all of the tools that you can apply, and then it's a question of knowing which tool to apply, taking a step back, measuring the results, doing some course correction, iterating, and improving over the initial result. And so you're saying, Yash, I'd probably replace the word expert with senior engineer, since expert is quite a broad term and can be interpreted as someone who knows everything, which is unrealistic. Exactly. Honestly, I would even go as far as saying that the word expert is kind of toxic, in the sense that it sets, as you've just said, unrealistic goals, both for what you expect from yourself and also what you expect from others. So that's why I wanted to address this topic. And once again, this is a question that I received like written like that. So it's something that someone like had in mind at some point, and so that's why I thought it was very important to address it. I see another question regarding localization and internationalization. Assuming our UIs are flexible enough to handle the content and writing directions, how to find the best people to localize, translate strings? I can tell you, Kevin, at work right now we use a tool called Localize. So it's Localize with a K, so LOKALISE.com. And from that tool, so you are able to order translations either from professional translators or from just native speakers. And I would say it works pretty well. Honestly, it's a pretty good tool. At least it's way better than just having like the big Excel or Google Sheet with all of your keys and translations. And yeah, also if you need to translate only into, DeepL, you're saying DeepL is kind of good if you want to do it by hand, but if you need to translate into like 30 languages, having a tool like Localize where you can do that like at scale can be a pretty good feature. Even though when you need to translate like strings into a big amount of languages, the price of the translation can also increase a lot. Of course, if your app is bringing in a lot of revenue, it makes total sense. But if you're still working on a small app, you might want to be careful because the price does increase pretty fast. Okay. Then, very interesting question. Can junior developers rise to senior positions within a few years if they are proficient enough? On that question, I will have a very opinionated answer, which will be a hard yes, because in the sense like that's what I have done basically. So I would say like if you put in the effort and you try to really like understand things and get some deep knowledge, there are definitely opportunities out there. I would also say you probably want to be aware of whether there are indeed growth opportunities in your company, in the sense that something that is a bit sad but also a bit true is that in a way companies tend to optimize for the team rather than the individual, in the sense that if a person is like growing faster than the other, and for some reason the company feels like they don't have anything to give to that person, then the company will probably like optimize for keeping the rest of the team working on homogeneous rather than helping that one person develop like their skills. So you want to be aware of that. But no, I would say like it's definitely like possible. And what I would recommend is, I'm basically like I know that at some point I'm going to be always saying the same things, but it's a good thing in a way if I kind of say the same thing for every question, because it means that at least I have some like consistent thinking on the topic, and I'm not just like making something new with every new question. But Yeah, if you like challenge yourself, I guess that would be like the big advice I would have, to challenge yourself in a way that is like sustainable. So the goal is not to like overwork yourself or whatever, but just like try to challenge yourself and be like, okay, like by the end of the week, what can I do to grow my skills? By the end of the month, by the end of the quarter, by the end of the year, that kind of things. You know, like you create basically like you set up milestones for yourself. And honestly, I think we are still in an industry where like it's very possible, if you are like talented and you're good at your job, to get either promoted in your company, or promoted in another team within your company if you are working in a big company, or to switch for another company and more senior and hopefully higher paying job. So yeah, I guess my point on that topic is that we are still in an industry where there is more demand for very good engineers than there are very good engineers available. So if you put in like the effort and you do it in a way where you're not just like wasting your energy, you know, you're not just like watching the same course over and over on Coursera. Honestly, I would say it's more than than doable. And I guess the main difficulty you could have is, yeah, if like you're trying to do things faster than the other people with you at work, then that's the kind of moment where it can be a bit difficult within your company, because when you're a bit like the exception. It's always like a tricky situation. So if you feel that you're not you don't have like the room to grow where you're at, it's definitely like fair game to look elsewhere. But it can be good to be aware that if, as you're making progress, you see that there is some pushback on people telling you maybe you should take your time a bit more. um, what you should do is like try and take the time to be to feel like, okay, are people telling me that because I'm trying to go too fast and I'm cutting corners, like I'm trying to take shortcuts, or I'm not like understanding deeply enough what I'm doing, which can be something that can happen. And in that case, it's important to recognize it and maybe take things a little bit slower and just like change a bit the way you do your things. But if you feel that no, you're making good progress and you're confident you're making good progress, and just like the company or the setup that you're in isn't providing you the opportunity, then it can be worth to have a look elsewhere. And I guess my deeper point is that it's not like if you get some feedback that maybe you're trying to go too fast, it might not be like your fault. It might be that indeed you're cutting corners, but it might also be that you're in an environment that is not designed for people that want to really have a really deep understandings of things early on. And that can happen. There are that kind of companies that do exist. And in that case, it's also important to recognize it and maybe like have a look elsewhere. But of course, there is no clear-cut like criterion for when that happens, and there is always a bit of the question of a bit of uncertainty that unfortunately you need to deal with. Let me see. I see a new question in the chat. Hello, Vincent. I am a junior developer, and last week I got offered an internship at a startup. However, I am lacking knowledge about architecture and how to build big scalable apps. How to go about it? Very good question. I would say if you haven't gotten started yet, honestly, a good thing to do can be to just ask the person that will be like your manager if they have any recommendation on material on learning material that you could if they have any recommendation on learning material that you could take a look at to prepare. That can be a great way to set yourself up for success. Like I can tell you, when I started my current job at a startup, I had questions about like more about company culture when compared to a big company, because I was working at a big company before, and that's what I asked the people, like what recommendation do you have for me to like already get up to speed with the culture that you have, and they recommended like a couple books, and I found that it was a great way to set yourself up for success. So that would be my advice, like try to be proactive, show ownership, and so just like ask the person that will be like either your manager or your lead developer, like some advice on how you can prepare, and I'm sure that they will be able to recommend a few things, or maybe they will just tell you, oh, don't worry, like we're going to cover this during the first weeks, and then it will also be good because it will allow you to, like lift a bit of a weight from your shoulders. But I guess the general advice I would have here is to show agency, show ownership, and just like ask people to set you for success. I guess that would be like the good advice. Like ask either your manager or your lead developer how they can set you up for success, and often just by doing that, you've done most of the effort, because then people are able to give you the resources and to help you, and it gets the conversation started. And you are saying, so in your own opinion, it feels like building big professional apps is hard and takes a lot of time for juniors. So building a full app might be overkill, maybe. Honestly, it really depends of the company, because not all companies have the same approach to architecture. There are some companies that had to iterate a lot to find their product market fit, and so basically, like you can see it in their code base that there have been a lot of trial and error, and the architecture might not be as clear cut as possible. So my advice would be really like get the conversation started, show that you are eager to succeed by getting the conversation started, and then like ask for advice, and the people that you will be working with are definitely the one who are best equipped to give you the best answer, because they are just the one who are already working in the code base daily. But thanks for the great question. I'm really happy like with the great question there have been in the chat. I feel it makes the live stream feel much more alive, and more importantly, feel the replay feel much more alive. Next question I had listed: how can you improve your skills outside of your working hours? I put this question there because it's always a big debate. Like, should you spend your own personal time to improve your skills? If you are able to do so, then is it a privilege compared to people who have less free time outside of work? So I guess I would say, I mean, in an ideal world, like your company should provide you the time to improve your skills during working hours. Now, if you decide to take things into your own hands, I would say at least do it in a way where you don't burn yourself out. In the sense that if you feel like I don't know, you've set some crazy goals for yourself and you spend all of your weekend following courses, that kind of thing, that's probably not healthy. Like maybe, I don't know, like if once you want to give yourself a challenge of I'm going to spend the whole weekend following a course, it can be a good experience, but don't do it twice, because that's how you burn yourself out. So I would say try to do, if you take some personal time to get better at iOS. I mean, that's absolutely within your right to do so, and that's something that I've done a lot, and that I'm still doing a lot with, for instance, with my content creation. But I would say do it in a way where you don't burn yourself out, and also it's not. Sometimes people talk about like the power of building habit, and it's important to set rules for yourself and follow them. That's true, but you don't want to fall into the trap where you set like a rule or a habit for yourself, and then you never get out of it, even when it's starting to become like toxic for you. Like, for instance, I've noticed it has happened to me that in my videos, I want to improve the quality of the videos, and so I start to put like more fancy stuff. Like I start, for instance, to do like intros and outros with face cam, that kind of stuff. But if at some point I feel like, oh, like doing this face cam intro and outros, they actually take quite a lot of effort, and maybe I should try and not do them all the time or whatever. It's perfectly fine, and you shouldn't feel guilty if at some point like you reduce your effort, because it's very easy to get into like a growth mindset where you always want to improve on what you've done like the past week. Like 1 week you do something great, and then that's become your new baseline and you want to improve on it. That works up to a certain point, but it's also perfectly okay like to just like take things a little bit like more slower when you feel less motivated or whatever. So like don't feel guilty if at some point in time you do less thing on your personal time. Take it more like when you do stuff on your personal time, you're trying to give a bonus to your career, you could say, but it doesn't have to be at the same amount of energy over the weeks and over the month. And the same way, like when you're starting a new job, it's normal that you make more efforts and the days are longer and you are more focused. But if it's still the case after like a year, maybe something is wrong, in the sense that this probably won't be sustainable over the course of an entire career. So it can be, like sometimes you need to sprint, and sometimes you need to just like relax and take the time. Typical example, if with WWDC like next week you spend a lot of time in June like following all of the new announcements, there is nothing that should prevent you from like taking it more easy like the following month. That's basically what I wanted to say like with this question. And I might not be the best example here, in the sense that I've done quite a lot of things on my personal time. I've also been very lucky that I had like the opportunities that made it worth it. But when it can be really frustrating is when you spend a lot of your personal time and you don't get like the reward that you expect. And when that happens, I guess it's also a moment where you need to like rethink your strategy. Is it still worth spending that much time? Are you spending your time in the right way? Basically, like it's not because you've been doing something for a few weeks or a few months that you should be doing it like forever. Like people evolve, things evolve. What was like good 2 weeks ago might not be that good right now. So iterate. It's one of the things I've said a lot in this live stream, but iterate a lot, and don't be afraid to change something that might have worked at some point, but for some reason now feels like it doesn't work as well as it used to for you. And maybe it will like maybe like you will put a lot of effort into learning new things 1 month, and you will feel great because you've learned a lot of new things and you've made the effort. Then you will be more relaxed for the next couple of months, and then you will see that the motivation is coming back again, and so you will be making more of an effort, and it's perfectly okay. Like you don't need to be like making crazy efforts all the time. That's definitely like that's definitely not worth it. At least that's not worth it because it's not sustainable. And what you want in the end, it's sustainability. Like you don't want to burn yourself out over 1, 2, or 3 years. You want to be able to keep making efforts over the few decades that a career is going to encompass. Okay. What did I list for the next question? How to handle a legacy project with technical debt? I think it's a question that many people can have in mind, especially because when you start, I mean, what is legacy code? What is technical debt? There are people who say that as soon as you have pushed your code to your Git repo, it has become legacy at best and technical debt at worst. I would say if you're in a situation where you feel like you're overwhelmed, because usually when people ask themselves this kind of question is because they are overwhelmed by the amount of legacy or technical debt, I would say 2 things. I would say first, try to narrow your focus. Even if you're working on a big code base, it's possible that for the task you've been assigned, you don't need to understand everything. So try to narrow your focus and only pay attention to what you actually need to understand to succeed in your current task. And also, try to get as much context as possible. Like why did things evolve in this way? First, because it's always like good to understand, and also because it might direct your choices in the future when you will in your own turn make design decisions that will lead to your code becoming technical debt or not. So that would be my two main advices. And then if your goal is to refactor and improve a code base, then I would say once again narrow your focus, in the sense try to understand what are like the biggest issues in the code base. It could be that some part of the code is unreliable and keeps crashing. It could be that some part of the architecture generates a lot of conflicts when people are merging their code. Try to understand what are the biggest issues and agree either with your team, with your lead, or whomever on what you should focus on, and really like narrow your focus. I guess that's really my key advice here, is narrowing your focus. Like you cannot fix everything at once. Like the days only have so many hours and you only have so much energy. So yeah, like narrow your focus, try to understand things and try to improve things a little by a little. And it's always better to improve things little by little, but regularly and steadily, rather than try to do one big push for improvement, and then after 2 weeks everyone has forgotten that we wanted to improve, and everyone is back to no longer caring. And also, if you're working in a team, it can be, I guess, the kind of situation where it's important to have like a team effort on the topic. So like to agree together as a team on these are the issues we have, this is the path we see to improving them. We are committing to this path, because of course you don't want to try and improve everything all by yourself, because you can only be a hero for so much time, and then you completely burn out, basically. Let me see. I see a comment. Yes, building personal projects are the best practice. I build free apps on the side and apply with just them and got internships. So don't be scared to apply soon. So yes, personal projects can definitely be good. They don't need to be like very advanced or whatever. They just have to be there and show that you made some effort. Also, just saying that you followed this course all the way to its end can be good. Like I've seen people apply to internships, and just because they said that they had followed a course on iOS, that was already something that was setting them apart from other candidates. So my take when it comes to applying is that whatever you have to say that can put you in a good light, you should share. Like even if it feels like it's a small thing, everything is a small thing. Everyone has started from zero, and people can recognize that even if you did something very simple, but at least you did it and you made the effort of sharing it, and that's already more than if you had just done nothing. So yeah, kind of like saying when you're taking an exam and you're asking a teacher like, should we say this in the answer, and he tells you like you should say whatever intelligent thing comes to mind, you should like say them in the exam paper. Basically, that's kind of the same idea. Whatever you have that can help you, like paint you in a positive light, you should share it. And honestly, if I see like a GitHub repo with someone that tried a few things, I mean, it's already something. Of course, if the person tells you like, I've done something that is amazing, and they've just like followed the tutorial, there is a bit of an issue. But if the person is just saying, yes, by the way, like I've done a few things, it's just small project, but you can check them out. That can be a very positive thing. At least like I don't see myself being like, oh, that person only did that and did not spend like 40 hours working on this small project. No, I'm not going to think that. Just one thing, if you have some code that is like quick and dirty, and you want to share it, make it clear somewhere that it was maybe just for experimenting, that kind of thing. I guess you don't want to share things that could paint you into a bad light. So like make it clear what you are sharing. If you are sharing like code that you just use to experiment after following a course, it's perfectly fine, but make it clear that it is like some experiment code. If you try to do a simple app and put it on the App Store, also explain it was a simple app, maybe that you did it like without the help of a designer, like share some context, because this is what will help people understand why you did what you did. And also, when we want to evaluate the quality of something, knowing the context in which it was made is important. Like, you won't evaluate the same some code the same way if I tell you that it's been made during a 24-hour hackathon than if I tell you that a team of 6 very knowledgeable people worked on it for a quarter. That's basically the idea here. Okay, let me move on a bit into the questions so that we don't finish too late. And I see that my voice is starting to kill me. So, app architecture. How to decide which architecture will work the best? And I guess we kind of like see a common thread with something I was saying just a bit earlier, that you need to ask the people you will be working with about how they build their app, because they are the ones who know the best about it. And here, what I wanted to highlight is the fact that how to decide which architecture will work the best. When you ask this question, there's actually one important part that is missing in the question, and it's the context. It's how to decide which architecture will work the best in a given context, because an architecture is about technical topics, because architecture, if you were to define it big picture, it's how you organize code, but it's how you organize code to achieve a certain goal or a certain set of goals, and these goals, they depend on the kind of companies that you are working on. And I'm going to share 2 examples that should make it very clear. So my previous job, I was working in a big company where we were doing apps for big French banks. So these are projects that would like last for maybe 6, 7, 8 years. So the apps that were created when I joined in 2016, I think they are still in production today. So still 8 years after, and people are still working on these apps. And the company was hiring mostly junior people, and there was a good turnover. So in this situation, you need to make an architecture that will give some strong guidelines on how to develop a new feature. And it's quite, it's also a good place to do it, because these are the kind of apps where your app is mostly a front end for a collection of API endpoints. So it's easy to give some common guidelines to all of your screens, because your screens, they will basically call a web service, get some data, display it on the screen, and then maybe call some other web service as a result of the actions that the user will take, which could be like filling a form, starting some payment process, whatever. So in this context, the right architecture was something that was relatively like, I'm trying to find the word in English, something that has strong guidelines that guides you a lot. But on the other hand, the app I work on today, the company focuses more on hiring very senior people and then iterating, experimenting a bit to find what works the best, because we do things around AI, and AI is still very new. And so we have a very different approach to architecture, because the goal first and foremost is to be able to ship things fast and get feedback from the user, get feedback from the market. And so from these 2 definitions, from these 2 situations, rather from these 2 different contexts, you can see that the architecture that works well in the first context wouldn't work well in the second, and vice versa. So when you think about architecture, you think about technical things, but also about business needs, the kind of companies that you are working on. So the answer here is that there is no good answer. There are bad answers, like for instance, using Viper for everything is definitely a bad answer. That's pretty sure. Using Massive View Controller for everything is also a bad answer. That's pretty sure. But in between, you have a lot of different places where you could adjust the slider to do you want to go toward an architecture that is much more opinionated and that guides you a lot, or do you want to go for something that are just simpler because you are a smaller team of more experienced people? And there is no good answer here. It depends a lot on the project and the context that you are working on. But it's important to be aware of this, because it's very easy to have people who have it's easy to fall into a situation where you have a very I don't know how to say it, a dogmatic approach to architecture. For instance, someone in their first job, people will be using MVVM and it was working very well the way they were using, and then that person is convinced that you should always use the same approach everywhere. And no, it's not because something was successful in a context that it will be successful in other contexts. Also, it's not because something didn't work in a context that it wouldn't work in other contexts. So it's very it's a spectrum. There is no clear-cut answer. And that's also why you need senior developers, because you need people that can make these trade-offs in real time, depending on on the actual situation, and also continuously correct their course as things evolve, as the team grow. That kind of thing. So here, for me, the important answer is that there is no best architecture. There are only collections of context, teams, business goals that make it so that one architecture will work more than another. But what you definitely want to avoid is either have the approach of this worked in the past, so it will work in the future, without considering why it actually worked, or just this thing is very fashionable right now, or this company is talking about that. For instance, at some point, Uber, they were talking a lot about their architecture, which they call RIBs, but Uber has hundreds of iOS engineers collaborating on the same apps, which might not be the same need than what you have in your own company. So I would say, yeah, the best answer here is exercise exercise your own judgment, exercise your best judgment, and there is no there is no clear-cut answer, unfortunately, but also fortunately, because this is what keeps the jobs open for senior iOS engineers. Okay, moving on to the next question. How to know when to ask for help? Because some people ask before they even try to solve the problems they have themselves, and some wait too long. Now, that's a question I really wanted to include, because it can be one of the main difficulties when you're getting started at work. When should you ask people for help when you feel stuck with something? I would say a right trade-off here might be to think, try to spend some time to come up with your own answer. So maybe, for instance, I don't know, you have a problem in the morning. Try to come up with your own solution up until lunch, and after lunch, share it either with your colleagues or with a lead developer, someone more experienced. But do the effort of trying to come up either with your own solution or to really understand the issue. But do that work of trying to solve it by yourself. And I see something very insightful being shared in the chat. So if you spend more than 10 minutes on an issue, I guess the idea is very insightful. If you spend more than X amount of time on an issue, now should 10 minutes be the right amount? I guess it kind of depends. It might be something also that you might want to discuss with the person that is mentoring you, technically, after how long should you reach out to them, because it might be different depending on the kind of culture that there is. But I would say, yeah, 10 minutes is a good lower bound, in the sense that I guess you shouldn't ask for help unless you spent at least 10 minutes on the topic, especially if it's something that is like new, you know, like if you've been already working on something and discussing it with other people, then maybe if you have one more question, don't wait 10 minutes. But if you encounter a problem, yes, definitely try to spend 10 minutes to find the answer yourself, just so that you can also like force yourself to develop the reflex of, okay, I have a problem, how could I find the solution? Maybe it could be by searching on Google. Maybe it could be by looking at the documentation. Maybe it could be by looking into like other places of the code base that are trying to face that face the same thing that you're trying to implement. There is a variety of ways to solve a challenge, and it can be hard to know like in which direction to go. And very often when people ask for help too soon, it's because they didn't know in which direction to go. I would say it's okay to go in the wrong direction the first time, because you just like you need to build experience to know in which direction to go intuitively. But maybe the answer I would get that would be maybe even better is so try to spend maybe between 10 minutes and an hour on the topic, and also document the way you're trying to solve the issue. So, and it's not like writing a big document, just like you open like notes on your computer and you write, okay, the problem that you have, where do you think you should be looking into for a solution, why, you know, you try to just document like in bullet point style your thinking process. This way, when you're going to discuss it with someone, you can also share with the person, okay, so here's the problem I had, here's what I tried to do to solve it, here's why it didn't work. And this way, first, the person will see that you put in the effort to do it, which is always a good thing, but also the person will be able to provide you much better feedback, because if the person just gives you the solution, it solves your problem, but maybe it won't help you like long term. But if the person tells you, oh, you see, so when you saw this issue, you try to look in that direction, but maybe what you should have done is maybe just like you see this error message, copy and paste it on Google and see what Google had to say about it. You know, like the more you document your thinking process, and the more people can help you improve that thinking process. Otherwise, people can just like give you the solution, and I would say this is not the best thing that will help you improve. So I guess the two things, like spending at least 10 minutes on the problem, and documenting it, and also maybe agreeing beforehand, especially for instance if you're an intern, agreeing with the person that is mentoring you, how should you do it when you are faced with an issue. And it could be things like you do a meeting like every day after lunch for the first month to discuss like what you've been doing in the morning, and do any course correction that could be needed before you move into the afternoon. That can be also a great solution, but you definitely want to build that muscle of when you have a problem, you try to solve it first. And it can be very easy, especially if you have a colleague that is very good and also very willing to help, to just try and ask that person way too much. But then in the long run, you kind of lose a bit your ability to be like autonomous. And I guess this is something that you want to develop, like be able to be autonomous, and to be autonomous when you are faced with an unknown problem, because at its core, engineering is kind of like being faced with ever new like unknown problems, and trying to find how to solve them. I see some messages. If you are a junior developer, what key aspects are senior developers looking for the most from you? In other words, how perfect a junior developer looks like? That's a good question. I wouldn't say like a perfect junior developer exists, but you can definitely have some like key success skills. I would say being eager to learn and to improve yourself, in the sense that it's okay to ask for things that you don't know. It's always okay. But of course, if you ask for the same thing 10 times, people will start to see it as a problem. And it does exist people that you keep telling them that they should do things a different way, and for some reason they don't seem to understand it, or to realize that they're not doing things like the right way. So I would say be eager, to learn, to ask for help when needed, but also trying to be autonomous. I guess what you want is to be autonomous, but not reckless, and maybe be yeah, be autonomous and reliable. For instance, if you see a problem and you're not sure of how to solve it, you can say okay, I'm faced with this problem, I'm not yet sure how to solve it. Is it okay if I spend one day working on it, and then we can talk about it, debrief afterwards? And I would say that's a great way to work, and it's much better than someone who will ask for help immediately, or someone that will go into a tunnel of working alone for one day, and then in the end people are like, oh, but wait, if you had told us that you were starting to work on that for such a long time, we would have given you this key piece of information that you couldn't have guessed by yourself. So I guess we're always keep coming to the same skills, but be reliable and be a good communicator. In a way, I would say when you work in any organization, maybe these are the two the biggest two success factors. Because if you're reliable, people know they can trust you and they don't have to worry whenever they give you a task. And if you are a good communicator, you are good at expressing what issues you might be facing and getting good feedback from others. So I would say, actually, whether you're a junior or a senior, the two things are true. And maybe if you're a junior, showing that you are eager to progress, and not in a sense of being a teacher's pet or whatever, but just by demonstrating that. That's a good question. How can you show that? How can you show that you want to progress without looking like someone who is showing off? That's a good question. That's a good question. How can you do that? I guess a good proxy would be to do things in a way where you're always trying to improve yourself, but you're not trying to belittle others. I guess if you can manage to progress without making either other people feel like they are less than you, or trying to make yourself look better than the other, you've already done 90% of the job. But it can also be asking people for advice, or asking people when they were in your own situation. So when they were getting started, what were the choices that they made that they think worked very well, and what didn't work well? That can be also a good idea to both get good advice and also show people that you are willing to progress, because you are asking yourself that kind of question. All right. Let me move on to the following question. How to overcome imposter syndrome, which is a question that often comes in one way or another. So I would say first, keep in mind that the more you know, the more you are aware of what you don't know. In the sense that someone who is very average or mediocre might feel much more confident than someone who is good, just because the person who is mediocre knows how to do mediocre stuff and is perfectly fine with it, whereas the person who has some good knowledge know that they could still do so much more, because they know in which direction they could still keep growing, and so they will feel less qualified. So it's something you definitely want to be careful about. And I would say maybe a good way to overcome this is to measure your progress, take a look at the code you were like writing like a year ago and see how much better it is today. Like I know that, for instance, me today, if I take a video that I've made like 6 months ago, then 1 year ago, then 2 years ago, then 3 years ago, hopefully I should definitely see some progress, and it should help me get a feeling that yes, I am making progress when it comes to making videos. Even though when I am into the day-to-day of making my new video, maybe I will feel like, oh, this is not that great, or maybe the way I said this thing could have been better, and I will be like a bit disappointed by what I've done just right now. But when I look at it and I compare it to what I was doing in the past, I will probably see that I've improved. So I would say, yeah, comparing like where you are today with where you were 6 months, 1 year, 2 years ago is a very good way to overcome imposter syndrome. Um, and then I guess there is always also the moment where you realize that people who have like strong responsibilities, often their skill isn't. That's what we were saying when we were talking about like the expert stance. It's not as much that they know all the good solution by heart, but rather that they know where to get started, and then they also know how to course correct very quickly and very efficiently. And maybe being like a good engineer is much more about this. However, it's not easy to understand it, especially because when you are still like in college, for instance, you are evaluated against a curriculum. So there are things that you are supposed to know, and then you take an exam on those things. But in real life, things are always a little bit like more blurry, and it's less about how to know by heart, how to react in every potential situation, but rather knowing what could be the good direction in which you should go, and then being able to take a step back, be like, okay, are we going to the right direction? If yes, let's keep going. If not, let's correct course by trying something that could be a bit different. I see a great question. What to do if your manager doesn't seem invested in you to get you to the next level? So I would like to make sure that I get the question correctly, because there is two ways that you can interpret this question. Actually, there are two ways I think I can interpret it. Is like, what if your manager is not invested enough to help you, which is one thing, one bad thing, but one thing. And then there is, what if your manager doesn't believe that you have the potential, which is a similar but still different thing. I would say if your manager is not invested, they might have, like their own reason, in the sense that yes, it's not great for you, but there are bad managers, and there are like managers who are not just invested, or maybe like it's just the way they are, or it's just that they have a lot going on in their personal life, whatever. I would say in that situation, like you can always keep in mind that, like, I mean, your career is your career, and you can take responsibility in like improving, and that might be. That might be by like asking other people at your job than your manager for their opinion. So it could be like more experienced developers. It could be even if you know, like the manager of another team, asking in a random conversation, oh, what do you think I should do? That can also be like a good way. Basically, like take matter into your own hands, and have a strong sense of agency. And I would say, even if you have a manager who is very invested in helping you, having a strong agency and a strong ownership of your career is always a good thing, because in the end, your career is your career, and no one knows better what you want than yourself. So it's important anyway to have this strong like ownership over it. And then if your manager doesn't believe in you, that's when it becomes a little bit like trickier. I guess what would be good is to try and act in good faith, in the sense that you can, of course, like I was saying just before, take agency, make the effort, try to show it. But if at some point you really believe that you have like the skills, but for some reason your manager just doesn't want to see it, that might be the time where you basically are forced to look elsewhere. So it could be like if you're working in a big company, applying to another team or look for a position elsewhere and see how it goes. Actually, if you feel like you have the skills but your manager doesn't believe in you, applying for the job you want somewhere just to go through the interview process and see how it goes can be a great way to unlock the situation, and also for you to gain confidence in your skills. I know people who apply to jobs even if they don't necessarily intend to actually switch jobs, but just to get a sense of how their skills are perceived by external entities, external people like managers, like recruiters, and that can be also a good strategy, I would say. And anyway, what you shouldn't do is if a manager tells you that you won't be able to achieve something and you feel that you really want to do it and that you're capable to do it, you shouldn't limit yourself just because someone told you that that it's not going to work. I can tell you that I've had some people that told me maybe I was trying to do something that was too ambitious or wouldn't work, and I didn't listen to them most of the time, and I still did, and I was lucky that it worked, and I didn't regret it. There were also times where I did listen to people telling me maybe I should lower my ambitions, and in the end I always kind of regretted lowering my ambitions. So I would say it's a question of, at the end of the day, do you feel comfortable with the choice you're making? Do you feel like you're making them in good faith, and that you're doing them in the way that you're not hurting other people? And if that's the case, then it's possible that maybe your manager doesn't believe in you, or just doesn't want you to grow as fast as you want or whatever. But disagreements do exist in the real world, and it's not because you disagree with someone that person is necessarily a bad person. Also, it might just be that you have two different sets of objectives that are completely disaligned at the moment, and for some reason it doesn't work. And then that's the moment where basically you need to think about yourself and what is best for you, and you shouldn't limit yourself just because it's not convenient for either your manager or your company or whatever. So I hope that also managed to answer your question. And I think also, yeah, how to overcome imposter syndrome. I think I said basically what I had to say about it. I think I still have 3 questions, which is good in terms of time, because I don't want it to do more than 2.5 hours, and I think we will end up with 2.5 hours of content. So next question is how to recognize when you should move on to another project or company due to slow technical growth. Also a very key skill. I would say it's more than how to recognize it. Being able to recognize it is definitely a key skill to have a good career growth, I would say. It's hard to have a clear-cut criterion, but I would say when you feel that I don't know, the days are becoming a bit boring, or that you're less eager or excited to get to work, that can be that can be a good sign. For instance, if you feel that I don't know, in the morning when you start working, it takes you a long time to actually get into the situation where you're actually working. If you procrastinate a lot, just going on social media or whatever, that might be a good sign that that you're not learning or progressing as much as you would. I would say that for me, it's whenever I feel that my daily motivation is decreasing, I always see it as a sign of, okay, maybe it means that what I'm doing is no longer interesting, and maybe I should take a bit of a step back and see how I can correct this thing. And it can be basically very simple thing. Maybe you've worked too much on a similar kind of task for the past few weeks or few months, and you want to work on different kind of task on your project if your project allows for it. It can be also if you So that's more like for a shorter, time frame. But also, if you see that you wanted to progress towards like a more senior position in your company, and it's been maybe like once or twice that you applied for this and you weren't selected, maybe also it can be a sign that okay, at this company, maybe you've made the effort of like doing everything that you could, but at some point, like there is some kind of glass ceiling that you find very difficult to break through. But it's true that for me, like I would say, it almost always boiled down to feeling a lack of motivation, feeling that yeah, I'm not as excited, but by what I'm doing. That's almost always how I would recognize it. And then once you recognize it, the question is what you do about it. Which here, yeah, there is a. I touched a bit about it just before, but there is still like no clear cut like rule. But I would say something that is always important is to realize that, especially if it's like the first time that you have this feeling, usually there are more opportunities possible in your current job than what you realize. That maybe there are things that you could be doing, but just because you didn't wonder about it, you didn't like realize they were possible. But sometimes just like talking with your manager and being like yeah, like it's true that I feel like I don't get as much of a sense of progression as I used to. Sometimes you'll see that it gets the conversation started, and you discover that, oh yes, but there is this thing that we would need someone to work on. Would you be interested to work on it? And you were not aware of it at all. So sometimes just like getting the conversation started can be a good thing. But I would say, yeah, if you feel that you are lacking in motivation and you feel like you really have to make an effort to get yourself to work every day, that's a good sign. Also, like if as soon as you start working, you're looking for the first pretext to stop and go do something else, or go talk to your neighbor, or whatever, or to your colleague, that can be also a good sign that what you're doing doesn't motivate you as much. And I guess it's also important to understand that like it's not a if you're not motivated by your work as much as you used to, it's not a bad thing in the sense that you haven't done something wrong. It might just be because like actually you've made a big effort to understand how things are going, and now there is nothing new for you to learn, and so you're feeling a little bit like not challenged enough. But what I'm saying, I wanted to say it because I think it's very easy, especially when you're a junior, to feel guilty because, like, you get to your first job, you're super motivated, there are a lot of things to learn. Then you actually put in the effort and you get better. You start to notice that there is some form of like I don't know, like things are becoming more and more mundane. You're always doing the same thing, and so your motivation decreases, and you start to feel guilty about it because you're like, oh, but I'm not as good as I used to be, or like I don't know, like the company trusted me, and I'm not like paying them back as much as I could, and that I think is something that. Is very bad to fall into that line of thinking. You shouldn't feel guilty if you're less motivated because you're less challenged, but rather you should see it as a good thing that you've identified this lack of motivation, and then a good thing that you want to act on it in order to restore your motivation. And yes, restoring your motivation will come by working on more advanced topic, or maybe taking more responsibilities. But it's not that you got good things because you were demotivated, which is a bad thing, but rather you've put some effort, which is a good thing, which led to you feeling less motivated. But because you identified it, then you went looking for new opportunities to grow, and it led to more good thing, basically. I don't know if it's super clear, but the bottom line is don't feel guilty if you're less motivated as a result of putting in the effort and then finding the job less challenging. It's definitely not something to be guilty about, and it's actually a pretty good sign that you're on the right dynamic, and you just need a way to step out of the tasks that are no longer as challenging and move on to newer tasks which will be more challenging for you. Okay, let me move on to what is, I think, the penultimate question, which is how do you interview less experienced people for open positions at your company? I think I got this question a few times because I think one of the big important milestone when you are working as an engineer is when you are the one interviewing other people, because first you apply for internship, you apply for your first job, and so you are interviewed by more senior, more experienced people. But time goes by, and one day you are the more experienced person, and so it's your turn to start and interview people, and then you wonder, but how am I going to do it? Like, what do you ask in an interview? And even though you might have done a dozen interviews, it seems like you've completely forgotten what an interview is about. So I would say, for this kind of topic, definitely you want to rely on what's already existing at your company. Like, your company already has procedures and processes for that, maybe technical tests, that kind of thing. But I would say, for the specific question of how do you interview like less experienced people, you cannot ask questions that are related to what you do daily, because just by the way the question is phrased, it's implied that you are more advanced in terms of experience. So like you wouldn't be asking, it wouldn't be a good way to evaluate a junior person by asking like some very advanced question that you would expect a more senior developer to be able to answer. But what you can do when you interview, I guess you can first try to look for like potential, because usually when you hire junior people, you don't hire them for the skills they have at the moment where they will sign their work contract, but rather you hire them for the skills they will be able to develop over the coming months and years. So I would say look for potential. That might mean like asking people like where they are in their learning journey, how they are trying, what are they doing to learn and improve. It can be also asking a few like technical questions. But you don't want to fall into the question where you ask like, you want to ask questions because they will be a proxy to evaluate something, in the sense that if someone tells you that they spent like 20 hours following a 20-hour course on learning Swift, then maybe you want to ask them some questions about the basics of Swift, like what's an optional and how do you use it. Questions like that, questions about the basics of UIKit, but you don't want to go into asking questions just like if it were a trivia game. Like what you want to evaluate is the potential, is the ability to learn, to be reliable, and so the question that you ask, they are proxies to evaluate that. And when you ask someone a technical question about Swift, what you want to know actually is not as much if they know the answer, but it can be also, are they able to communicate the answer clearly? Are they also able to take like a step back on what they've learned? So you can do that by asking questions, like for instance, in your last job or in your last experience with iOS, what did you find the most challenging? What did you find the most rewarding when you were able to solve a problem? That kind of question that force a candidate to kickstart their thinking process, and basically like forces them to give answers that are kind of insightful, in the sense that they're not just giving like a standard answer to a standard question, but you're forcing them to reflect on their past experiences. I think also one of the reasons why I listed this question is because I wouldn't say that there is a good way to interview people, in the sense that every person is different, and so every interviewer is different. But I would say, if I were to sum it up, I would say first you kind of want to set a lower bound or a threshold of technical knowledge that the person should have, and so you can design maybe like 3 or 4 questions that are designed designed, yes, to evaluate whether or not the people meet that threshold. And then you want to evaluate like for the potential, and for that you want to know when faced with a problem how people like approach that problem. So you could also like ask more open question, like say, okay, let's imagine that you are faced with that situation. How would you go about solving it? And make it clear that the goal here is not necessarily like to provide like the best answer, but rather to kickstart a thought process and see how people are going through in that thought process. And also try to evaluate in a way kind of like the track record of a candidate, in the sense that if someone manage like to progress a lot in their previous job, there is a good chance that they will be able to do the same thing in their new job. So of course, people can always lie, but if you ask questions in a way where you're forcing people to really explain what they've done, it becomes harder to lie. Basically, if you are asking a very generic question, people can give you a very generic hard question, a very generic false answer. But if you ask people, okay, can you tell me like precisely during the last year what was the most complicated thing you had to solve technically, people will need to be able to think about it. And then if you ask a few follow-up questions, it will be pretty hard to lie about it. And basically, if the person can lie about it effectively, maybe the person doesn't have very good ethics, but at least the person would be very good technically to be able to come up with a fabricated answer that would still appear like it's legit. So I feel like I've been like rambling a lot about this question, but yeah, if I were to sum it up, like set the minimum bar of technical knowledge and evaluate it with some questions. If possible, if you have multiple candidates, try to ask the same questions to all the candidates. This way, it makes it much easier to compare and to actually just know what is a very good answer and what is maybe a more subpar answer, and then evaluate by for the potential. And for that, you need to look at the track record, and so ask people deep question about their past experience, how they went, what they've enjoyed a lot, what they didn't enjoy, what they found the most rewarding, the most challenging. That kind of question that basically forces you to reflect, think in real time. And basically, because it's when people think in real time and answer in real time, that you get to the answer that are, I guess, the most like truthful, in the sense that they are the less prepared. Like, it's very easy to prepare for the first question. It's much harder to prepare for the follow-up question that will come just after. And I think we've reached the last question that I had in my list, which is what soft skills would help you the most in your career as an iOS developer? And I think I've touched on that point quite a lot. Actually, throughout the question, I think what I've been saying the most is be reliable and be a good communicator. So being a good communicator, I would say in the soft skills, definitely fits the bill. Being reliable is also, I guess, a soft skill, even though it might not be the one that you think of the most. But for the soft skill, I would say, yeah, be a good communicator and be good at understanding things from someone else's point of view. Whether it is a user using your app, it's a project manager that needs to deliver something on time, a stakeholder that has some goal to achieve. Being able to put yourself into someone else's shoes and see the world as they see it is a great way to know how to interact with that person. Arguably, this is also part of being a good communicator, because part of being a good communicator is adjusting the way you communicate with the audience you have in front of you. But I would say it can also be a very like independent skill of being like, okay, how is that person seeing the world, and what is important for them. It can also be part of being reliable, because actually when you say that you are reliable, um, how do I phrase it? But not that you are lying, but you're never reliable. It's more that people find you reliable, and the fact that they find you reliable, it means that you act in a way that matches what they expect of someone in your position, and what they will expect from you will depend on that person and the way that person sees the world. For instance, for a project manager, maybe reliability means delivering things on time. Maybe for, I don't know, like your manager who is tasked with dealing with a high turnover on the team, reliability will be the fact that you will be able to efficiently coach the 4 people that he has hired that have joined the team. You see what I mean? Like reliability is not like I mean, reliability is not a silver bullet. It's more like being able to understand what people expect from you, and either delivering what they expect, or if you can't, explaining to them why it's not possible. And that's actually also a part of being reliable. It's delivering what you said you would deliver, but also when you know you can deliver, being very clear about it so that people can adjust, plan around it, and basically, like, you don't want to abandon people in the middle of the road when something isn't working. And I see an interesting point, being able to Google search for answers. I agree it's a very good skill, but for a developer, honestly, I'm not sure I would put it in the soft skills, maybe more as a hard skill, because it's still like, it's, I would see it more as a way to do the task that you've been assigned, rather than be efficient in the organization that you are a part of. But to be honest, the definition between hard skill and soft skills, it's also like, how do you tell which is a hard skill and which is a soft skill? It's also like a spectrum, and being able to use Google, like, to find the answers you need, whether they are technical or non-technical, is indeed a very good skill, and could also tend more towards soft skills. Let me see. Dimitris, you were saying, hello, I just joined. I don't know if it's already answered, but what do you think are the necessary skills to have to apply for a job? Oh, okay, so you were answering. Okay, sorry, I didn't get it that way. So you were answering. Okay, so indeed it was answered before, so you will be able to find it in the replay. It will be available like as soon as the live has ended. But what I said, if I just sum it up, basically, like, demonstrate that you're eager to learn, demonstrate potential, and demonstrate that you are personally, like, invested in doing iOS. And it doesn't mean like that you've developed like 10 apps by yourself. Just like, people need to feel that you didn't end up wanting to do iOS just because a random choice. Because, like, there are technologies where it can happen. Like, for instance, if you are graduating with a CS degree, it's much easier to end up into front-end development just because, like, you follow the movement, than doing iOS, because iOS is a bit more specific. Or like 10 years ago, if you were a CS graduate, it was very easy to end up doing some backend Java with Spring, working with Spring, for instance, because there were lots of job posting for that, because often you had already worked a bit with this technology when you were in college, that kind of thing. So iOS, since it's a bit of not an alternative career path, absolutely not, but it's not it's not supposed to be that a career path that you can just stumble onto it because you've done the minimum effort in your studies or whatever. People need to feel that you made a conscious, that's what I want to say. People need to feel that you've made a conscious choice to look for an iOS job and to follow an iOS career. And so how do you show it? You show it by saying, I mean, maybe like you watched a course about iOS, maybe just you've had an iPhone or an iOS device for a long time, and you have a lot of experience like using the apps, and you find they are very useful, and you would like to build apps for you also like to build apps for a living. It can be anything that makes people think that you're here for a reason, and when you will be faced with difficulties, and we are all faced with difficulties at some point or another, then you will have the motivation to just like face them and tackle the issues that you will encounter. Basically, that you will not give up when it will become difficult, or when there is the first like tricky bug. You will not be like, oh, I don't know, and I don't care. Basically, that's the gist of it that they can try to answer. Okay, I can see it's getting late because I feel like I'm much less focused in my answer than when I was just getting started for this live. But yeah, it was the last question. So soft skills, being a good communicator, and being a good team player, like being reliable for other people. I guess it's the key soft skills that I would recommend. And I think it's been 2 hours and a half, and I think it's more than enough, in the sense that for me in France it's currently 10:30 p.m. I still haven't eaten, and I'm starting to get a bit tired. So I think this is when I'm going to end this live stream. But before I end it, I want to say a big thank you to all the people during the live that asked great comments. I have the number. There were 70 comments during this live, and the question and the remark made it feel much more alive, not only for me but also for the people watching the replay. So thank you all for being so involved and engaged during this live stream. I hope you've enjoyed this new format. It's a format I wanted to do for a long time, but never took the time to do it. Or also, I guess maybe I was a bit afraid of talking about topics that are less clear cut than just code. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you know colleagues that could find it useful, please share it with them. My goal with this live is also that when someone asks me a career question by DM, I can now redirect them toward this goal and tell them you should be able to find the answers in this live, where I took the time to give my opinion on the questions where I was asked the most. And what else can I say before we end? Oh yes, of course. If you have ideas for other live streams around this topic of career advice, or more general, more non-technical topic, please let me know. Maybe not in the chat because I'm going to end the live soon, but in the comments, let me know your ideas, or just send me a message on whatever social media platform. And really curious to hear about these ideas, because I see that you seem to have enjoyed this live stream, and so if I can make others with a similar format but on other topics, I guess it could be a great idea. And I think I have spoken more than enough for today. I will just say once again, big thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for watching. And see you next time for another live or another video. Bye bye.